Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday and happy December 1st. Can't believe we're at the end of 2023. My name is Lisa Kumagai. I am the Regional Outreach Manager with Neurologics, and we are so excited to have you here today on our webinar on trauma-informed care and neurologics. So whether you're on live or watching the recording, we appreciate your time. You'll be hearing from our founder and chairman, Karen Odell Barber. Karen has over 25 years of experience as an adolescent and young adult therapist. She's an Arizona Regent Scholar and studied at the London School of Economics after she completed her undergraduate degree. She then went on to complete her master's degree in counseling at San Francisco State University with postgraduate training and addiction treatment from UC Berkeley. Karen is an experienced public speaker and has presented at various behavioral health and neuroscience conferences throughout the US. I'm excited to hear from her today. You'll also be hearing from Dr. Peter Michalecki. Peter has worked with Neurologics for 6 years in diverse capacities. He consults with clients and partners about brain mapping and optimization. He provides scientific and technical writing support and is also on call in the event that anyone needs a pair of bespoke shoes or boots made. Yes, he's a cobbler. Peter's graduate and postdoctoral training was in biochemistry, and he has 2 decades of experience in the world of teaching, mentoring, and private school administration. Once upon a time, here's a fun fact, he was an Arabic linguist interrogator in the Army. But don't be fooled. He's an affable Midwesterner, kid at heart, mostly. So before I hand it over to Peter, I just want to say that this webinar is for all of you listening. So as questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat so that we can make sure we get your questions answered for you, whether it's during or at the end, or if you're watching this recording and it sparks curiosity, please feel free to reach out to us, to me, and we'll be sure to get you the information that you're hoping to find. So with further ado, I'm handing it over to Peter.
Thank you, Lisa. Everybody can hear me? Yes? All right, I'm going to share my screen and I'll get started with our presentation. And please, as Lisa said, don't hesitate to, I will be making special efforts to keep my comments short so that we have time for questions at the end. And also it's going to be important that you hear not only from me, but from Karen. All right. Just confirmation are my slides showing?
Nope.
No, not yet.
All right.
And while Peter's figuring that out, I'm going to say to all of you that there's no such thing as a dumb question. One of the other many talents that Peter has is writing the books for dummies. And I just want to say, for my own sense of humility, when I first started delving into how the brain works 14 years ago, I thought I was the only person on the planet who didn't know these things, and found out most of the things that Peter's going to talk about from the brain-based perspective, only a very small number of people know. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat box. And one of the other things that Lisa and Michelle are amazing at is connecting clinicians, providers, parents with complimentary consultation with one of our doctors to talk through specific case questions, or just questions that you might have that you don't feel comfortable asking in more of a public forum like this. We also have once a month coffee chats, and those are great forums to bring questions or cases in person. So I just want to reach out with the invitation of saying, sometimes even when Peter tries to dumb it down, he is so stellar and not dumb that when I say, hey, Peter, dumb this down, and he chuckles and says, Karen, I already did. Just know that if this is too dense or you have questions, throw it in the chat box or get Lisa to connect you, and we'd absolutely be happy to offer complimentary consultation to have your questions answered very specifically.
Thank you, Karen. All right, someone has told me that my slides are showing now, so I'm going to get going. So trauma-informed care and neurologics. What are we going to talk about today? Well, if my slides would actually advance, there we go. All right. What we're going to talk about are key elements of the trauma-informed approach, which is going to be, I understand, review for most people who are going to be at this webinar. But because it's such a huge field, with different faces that show themselves in different settings, it's good to get ourselves on the same page about the particular lens we're looking through. We're going to then talk about the evolution of the brain-centered understanding of trauma. And that's obviously a focus that we take to heart, especially here at Neurologics. We're going to take just a moment to, without going too deeply into the weeds of theory, appreciate how the concept of a complex adaptive system applies to trauma as a whole, applies to the brain, applies to the brain-body system, and to a whole bunch of other things as well, and is relevant to how we think about working with people who have experienced trauma. So we're going to appreciate the brain specifically as a complex adaptive system. And then we're going to talk about how Neurologics specifically with our brain maps and optimization can support trauma-informed care, how we ourselves adjust and tailor how we work in a trauma-informed way, and how we can support you in your work with your patients in a trauma-informed approach. And then we'll have time at the end to share some of the results that can be achieved when we work together with you to support patients. Okay, so to get ourselves all on the same page about what we all mean when we talk about a trauma-informed approach, I've chosen what I think is probably, at least in the substance abuse and mental health industry, the most commonly cited framework for trauma-informed approaches and trauma-informed care, which is SAMHSA's 6 guiding principles. The things that I would point out about these 6 principles: safety, trustworthiness, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and then cultural, historical, and gender issues, is that they have a kind of a implicit scale to them, where we work from the individual and their personal experiences by slow degrees outwards into feeling safe with their immediate environment, being able to connect with small peer groups, now being able to connect with larger groups, feeling like they have a voice in the larger world around them, and then how they connect with society at large. The framework was established to try to bring together and unify a lot of individual initiatives that all had similar messages, but presented them in different ways. And it became a little bit confusing for a while. So these guiding principles have helped to provide a common framework and language. The other thing to notice about these principles is that they tend to emphasize traits of a system or of an environment or values. And to go with the 6 guiding principles, SAMHSA also provided the 4 R's of trauma-informed care: realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. On a day-to-day basis, sometimes these are more useful for practical action. The guiding principles, the 6 guiding principles, are really more intended for strategic planning and an organization's level analysis of how are we structuring ourselves to provide support. But on a day-to-day basis, we just want to make sure that we as individuals and the organizations that we're part of do these 4 R's. The 4 R's emphasize actual functions, actions, as opposed to traits or characteristics. And at the end of the day, what the whole trauma-informed approach tells us is that trauma is complex, and that it's experienced by people who are complex, who experience the trauma within complex environments. That's why we need something like a framework. Now, to contrast with the complexity that the trauma-informed care approach is trying to address, if we look at the earliest brain-based understandings of trauma, we see that the systems that those we're talking about were maybe not up to the task to address all that complexity. They were simple systems. So what I'm showing you here is a version of what I'm sure all of us have seen many times, which is the big 3. The big 3 regions of the brain that constantly get referred to when we talk about trauma and trauma processing: the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. Now, they're all super important, and it's appropriate that a simple system includes them, but they are limited. This model is limited in what it can explain and what it can predict. And usually when we see an image like this put before us, we get some explanation about trauma processing that basically at the end of the day boils down to amygdala equals fear, hippocampus equals memory, prefrontal cortex equals cognition. And again, there's nothing false about that presentation, but it's nowhere near sophisticated or supple enough to be useful in dealing with the complex trauma situations that we encounter. And this is an early model. Over time, one of the important additions or expansions to this model was the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which continues to appropriately get a lot of attention. In this model, the brain is still generally thought of as the center, but now we've included other parts of the brain, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. And this model that now includes not just the nervous system, but the endocrine system and its hormones, along with other target organs in the body, like the glands. This now is great at explaining and predicting things having to do with the fight or flight response, which is obviously of major concern to trauma issues. One thing to notice as we add the HPA axis to the big three model of the brain is that, as I mentioned, we're now including multiple body systems. We now have lots of opportunities for feed forward signals and feedback signals. And we're including structures at multiple scales, the whole organism, individual organs, and individual tissues. So things are getting a little less simple. Now we're talking about the brain and the body. And really, once we get to a model that's even at this level of complexity, now we start having traction and we can start having some really robust theory, which is where we get images like this. I imagine almost everybody, if not everybody in this webinar, will have seen this image. It's from the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And it shows that the brain body model, it's not showing the adrenal gland or all of that specifically, but it's showing the effects on the body that occur during the fight or flight response. And so maybe if we had to distill the long-term impact that's still ongoing of this concept of how the brain is a node in the center of a larger system that processes trauma, I would say it comes down to this sentence from Bessel van der Kolk, which is, for real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. And that does a nice job of summarizing a lot of the approaches that are effective in trauma therapy today, both somatic approaches and cognitive approaches and other approaches. And the sentence that I love within this is the body needs to learn. And built into that expression is the idea that brains aren't the only things that can learn. Brains aren't the only things that can do, in some sense, cognition, that other complex systems can, in some sense, do cognition. And this idea of cognition has actually, for a while, even beyond the body keeps the score, cognition as a general idea that applies to any complex system is, well, hot, we'll just say right now. People talk about our metabolism by itself doing cognition, for example. And so a good snapshot of where a body and brain-centered understanding of trauma might be at the current moment is captured in this image. The point of this image is not for us to get lost in all of the details. I just want to point out two things. One, this is current, this is 2023. And then two, let's just look at how comprehensive, as incomplete as this likely is, how relatively comprehensive the system that we're now considering is when we think about responses to trauma. We've still got the brain crammed in here at the top, and we just slap a label on it that says cognition, but we now are featuring the brain interacting with multiple body systems, the endocrine, the neural, the immune, metabolism as a whole. We've now included entirely different species, our gut microbiota that live within us and contribute to trauma and stress response. The levels that we're now considering are communities of different species, organisms, organs, tissues, cells, receptors, and individual molecules that act as signals. That's a huge range of scales, all of which have complexity within them and complexity in their feed forward and feedback interactions across them. And so what we've got here is a bona fide complex adaptive system involved with trauma. It's not simple at all, and yet it is simple relative to the complete complex adaptive system that's relevant to trauma. Now, I keep on throwing out this phrase complex adaptive system, which is an idea that exists outside of the whole trauma field, right? It's got its own body of theory, but the basic idea of a complex adaptive system is that it's a system that exists across a wide spectrum of scales. There are networks of interacting components within it, and they organize themselves. There's no agent that's imposing a design on them. The organization that emerges naturally from their interactions. It exhibits emergent behaviors. There's lots of feedbacks, feed forward and feedback communication. And when you take all of these properties and put them together and take that system and have it interact within an environment, what happens over time is that the system comes to reflect the environment that it's interacting with. And that's essentially what learning is it's a system coming to, in some sense, reflect the environment that it's interacting with. And maladaptive trauma responses are a form of learning. Adaptive trauma responses are a form of learning. So that's what I mean when I say complex adaptive system. So the thing about complex adaptive systems is it turns out that it's complex adaptive systems all the way down. Whether we're talking about global climate change or trauma, the most comprehensive explanation and the scope of things that we really, in a complete sense, need to pay attention to go from things like the global environment through transportation systems, local environments, communities and groups, social media and other kinds of media, obviously the body, which is what we've been focusing on so far, all the way down to individual bases of DNA and individual molecules. So that's all we have to master in order to do a good job with trauma. And so that's a lot. My hope here is that we all feel overwhelmed and exhausted and like we're just ready to throw up our hands and say it's all too much. But of course, we're not going to do that. So then we say, well, where do we begin? And, you know, different people in this field can start their journey at different places. The point is simply to pick one scale. What makes this overwhelming is the huge breadth of scales. Pick one scale, focus on it, and then work outwards from there. So at Neurologics, what we've picked as our scale, not because we think it's the only scale, but just because it's what we focus on, is the brain. We view the brain as the foundation in some sense for everything. Certainly, we view it as the foundation for cognition. So if we're looking at cognitive function, our approach at Neurologics is it's important to work from the foundation up. So that's one direction of working outwards. How do we do that? What does that look like? Well, this figure does a pretty good job of kind of capturing the scale where most of our thinking at Neurologics lies. What we basically do is we connect cognitive and emotional functions of the brain / brain and body. We connect those functions to dynamic activity across distinct brain networks. So we do obviously study the brain, but specifically what we spend a lot of our time thinking about is brain networks. And this is different from sort of a 1970s, 1980s even 90s approach to the brain, which dealt more with, regional functions of the brain. This part of the brain does this function, that part of the brain does that function. That's to some extent true, but really the lesson that we've all learned since really starting in the 80s, a flood of new imaging data became available, and functional imaging in particular, is that the brain does what it does, not simply by apportioning different tasks to different regions, but really those regions work together in coordinated networks such that cognition is a kind of choreography of activity that's being dynamically handed off between these networks. And so in our model, we will talk about networks like the salience network, which notices what seems to be most important or prominent, or the executive network, which allows us to try and formulate plans of action based on our goals and our models of how the world works. And we connect activity in those networks to functions that are important. Things like coping, appraisal, adaptation, and a great many more, even more specific functions dealing with cognition and regulation. And then we can think about the brain as these networks play out either adaptively or maladaptively. The brain can occupy different states, like stuck states or uncertain states. So that just gives you a flavor of how we're thinking about that. But we don't forget that the brain is connected to the body, right? So things like the HPA axis that we were talking about and hormonal impacts, those are all part of our model as well, but because of the scale we've picked, they're not where we start. So if we take a slightly closer look at some of those networks in the brain that we talk about, there are different ways to construct these, but a sort of common way is what you see here. The networks have names like somatomotor, dorsal attention, visual, salience, default mode, frontal parietal. And the basic idea is that these networks do have sort of their own domains of focus, but it's really their interactive and dynamic coordination tied together through something called the global workspace that allows us to coordinate things like perception, long-term memory, short-term memory, attention, evaluation, to produce adaptive actions through the motor system. All right. So how do we do that? How do we view the activity in these networks and connect all that measured activity to function? At Neurologics, our tool is EEG. We measure brain waves. And so up top here, you see a picture of some of those networks that I was talking about, visualized from the top down, which is a perspective we often take when we work with EEG data. We have clients wear sensor caps, where sensors collect EEG signals from across the scalp. And what they're measuring is a collection of brain signals from throughout the entire brain. The signals that come through most clearly are those that come from the outermost layer of the brain, the cortex, but we also get signal from subcortical, more inward lying portions of the brain. A big part of the cool technology part is how we mathematically disentangle all of those signals. And what's important about Neurologics is that we measure those signals not only at rest, with the client just sitting calmly with their eyes open and then later with and also with their eyes closed, but we also measure the activity as the client does tasks. And that's a rich source of information. So we make the measurements. We can then use math to estimate the source of distinct components of the brain waves. And then by measuring signals over time, we can come up with a model of how communication occurs across different regions of the brain, and then correlate that with the different networks. Here's just a snapshot of of one way to view the data that we might get from what we call a brain map, which is the first step that we take as a baseline when we work with a new client. We don't need to go into all of the details about how we interpret all this right now. What I want you to appreciate is what I've already talked about and the way in which we're thinking about these signals. And again, I want to emphasize we're thinking about these signals in the context of the brain being interconnected with the larger complex adaptive system of the body, and that's super important for trauma. One of the things, and I'll hit on this later, that's really important is that because this is just objective data that doesn't rely on client reports, sometimes even unreported traumas can reveal themselves in a brain map like this. Particularly when you understand that we're not looking only at this data, we're looking at this data alongside a lot of other information. So we have a rigorous intake process, right? We do a medical history, cognitive testing, a developmental assessment, and a personality inventory. And so the combination of all of that information alongside the brain map is pretty informative. And it can provide a useful window on trauma. The brain map ideally acts as a guide or a roadmap to the next step, which is the therapeutic component, and we call it optimization. And essentially, the long and short of it is we can observe among all of those networks that are communicating with one another, we can observe inefficiencies in communication, and we can use optimization in a very targeted way to improve the communication among the networks to produce more adaptive function. What that looks like real short is we've got special equipment and laptops that we give to each client. The laptop has software that they use to engage in dynamic activities that change in real time. They're kind of like brain games that you may be familiar with, but they're a lot more sophisticated. As the client does the activities in real time, EEG is being measured from sensors that they wear. Each client doesn't just log on and do this by themselves. They're paired up with a neuroengineering coach who guides them through and makes adjustments if necessary in real time. Usually it's 3 times per week, an hour or just under an hour each session. And this might go on for 3 to 4 months typically, although it can be longer. Every case is unique. What's really great is that optimization can be useful really irrespective of when you begin it. You could start optimization proximal to a triggering event, but you can also gain significant benefits if you start months or years after the event. A lot of times, particularly when we're working with patients who've experienced trauma, it's necessary to be really flexible with the scheduling and the timing of an optimization program. Sometimes we might need to pause for a while because of other events that are occurring or because of changes in medication that they're undergoing. And that's fine. We can do that. And because of how we do optimization, and this is a distinguishing factor for Neurologics, the client will not lose appreciably the gains that they've made up to that point. And that's not the case for all sorts of brain-based therapies. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, this sounds a lot like neurofeedback, right? Brainwaves, EEG. It also sounds a little bit like brain training or brain games. And superficially, neuroengineering and optimization do have some similarities, but fundamentally, they're deeply different. To talk specifically about neurofeedback for a second, just to distinguish the neuroengineering that we do in optimization from neurofeedback. Neurofeedback, and this is not to put down neurofeedback, it's just to distinguish what we do from neurofeedback. It sets its sights on temporary symptom reduction. And the reason that it achieves mostly temporary symptom reduction is that it's not, for the most part, thinking in a comprehensive way about the complex adaptive system of the brain. It's not thinking about how networks interact dynamically over time. It's focusing on a few specific regions of the brain and measuring very particular signals or ratios of signals. It has some advantages. It's easier to do. It takes less training to implement. And for some situations, it may be the right call. But the key is what we're going for there is temporary symptom reduction. The more comprehensive set of measurements that we make at Neurologics, and importantly, the more comprehensive set of systems that we're considering as we put together a program, results in not temporary symptom reduction, but actual synaptogenesis, right? Forging new connections and strengthening them where they need to be strengthened, weakening them where they need to be weakened. That leads to long-term cognitive repair. So that's a key difference. The other huge differentiator, which is largely under the hood and might go unappreciated unless you're looking really closely, that distinguishes optimization from the brain games and the neurofeedback, are that we explicitly build the idea of an adaptive cycle into optimization programs. An adaptive cycle is a general property of any complex adaptive system, from an ecosystem to a brain to a cell. In long story short, an adaptive cycle is a cycle that includes both long-term components where systems try and hold onto the structures within them that seem to be useful, followed by fast-moving sort of revolution phases where there's rapid rearrangement of components and a lot of diversity, and then new useful structures get selected from within that collection of components. And we go around and around and around. And that is a model that informs how we build optimization programs. And in the context of optimization, the adaptive cycles cycle back and forth between what we call flourishing, which has a lot to do with increasing processing speed, and what we call alignment, which has a lot to do with increasing working memory. So this is very cognitively focused, but it has implications for emotional regulation as well. We go back and forth in this cycle across a longer term course of development. Within each cycle, we are building cognitive capacity from the bottom up. Remember that importance of building cognition from the bottom up. And then this is the last key differentiator. We are constantly measuring different metrics of neural homeostasis. The basic idea here is when you start training, any kind of training, in the brain, you're essentially starting a billion different little construction projects. And that's great. But you need to not only build your new connections, you need to surround those new connections with infrastructure to support them for the long term. There's a lot of neurobiology that goes into this, but the big idea is you need to make sure that you're doing your optimization in such a way and for a sufficient time that those new structures, those new connections are going to stick around even after you're no longer doing the training. All right. So what does all of this do for us? And what does it have to do with trauma? So brain maps can do two really useful things with respect to trauma. They can provide signatures of trauma, things that we can observe, and they can provide some predictions about trauma-associated symptoms. So with regard to the signatures or things that we can observe, obvious things that we can observe are reduced cognitive performance or inefficient information processing. But maybe some less obvious things that we can measure signatures for are things like impaired self-regulation, chronic pain or inflammation. Head injury is an obvious one. Markers for substance use, developmental issues, and then all of those brain-body types of issues have signatures. They're not always easily differentiable. We can't necessarily take a look at a brain map and say, oh, no, this is a metabolic disturbance and not a heavy metal exposure. But we can notice a disturbance which likely has one of these causes, which allows us to then initiate follow-up and working in close collaboration with our partners. A lot of these things are things that may not be reported because people might not be aware of them. We can also make predictions about symptoms that people will likely experience as a result of what we see on the brain map. things like diminished resilience or low self-monitoring, problems with regulation or self-soothing, sensitivity to different kinds of stressors, cognitive inflexibility. The list goes on, but that's very useful to know, and it can inform, again, as we work together with our partners, a larger ongoing program that includes Neurologics. We know and we promote is not best done by itself. It's done best as part of a larger therapeutic program that includes cognitive, somatic, and other modalities as well. Now, I've talked about all these cool things that we can measure and see and predict, but we should acknowledge that the best evidence of trauma is when a patient reports trauma, right? That's a really good clue. And now they may report that to us, but they might not, right? They are certainly pretty likely at some point, if they're in a position to do so, to report the trauma to one of our partners. And so that's why, we want to seize on, obviously, the most valuable information and share it. We're part of a team. So that's the most important thing. But patients are not always fully aware of their trauma. And in fact, that unawareness can itself be part of the trauma response. It is, in a deep level, an adaptive response. It's part of a survival mechanism. And even if the patients are aware of the trauma, they may not report it for any of a number of reasons. And that also can be a feature of the trauma response. So because trauma is not always reported, it's really useful to have an objective way to measure it, even when it's not being reported. So what is this survival mechanism that can lead to unreported trauma all about? This is actually something that can be explained pretty well by those big three: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. And so in the normal course of events, the amygdala communicates emotional information to the hippocampus, which uses that emotional information to decide what needs to be stored long-term in our declarative memory. And that gets further informed by neurotransmitters like dopamine acting in the deep structures of the brain. And so that's what happens normally. And that's what leads to our autobiographical memory, our sense of what the story we've lived and what we can talk about. However, in trauma, what can happen is that the communication from the amygdala to the hippocampus can be inhibited, such that the memories of the traumatic events don't get stored in the same way or to the same extent, and therefore can't be fed forward into the prefrontal cortex, which takes those memories and knits them together into our model of the world and ourselves within it. So that's part of a survival mechanism. And basically why it's adaptive in the short term is that it allows the most severe impacts of the traumatic memories to be sort of put on the shelf or set aside, such that the organism can continue to do what it needs to do in the short to middle term to survive. But it's not necessarily great for humans in a long-term context. So if we're not reporting the trauma, and in the absence of a brain map that can see signatures of the unreported trauma, what might trauma look like? Well, this is a model that I think everyone here is probably familiar with, the 4F model. So basically the idea is there's 4 sort of different clusters of symptoms or behaviors that can emerge when we've got trauma: fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. And a really great way to think about, well, which of these clusters might we be observing, has to do with thinking of them as having to do with the direction in which the client departs from a feeling of safety. And how they depart from safety depends on their level of arousal. They can be hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, and their intrinsic tendencies about approach versus avoidance, very basic sort of behaviorist kinds of tendencies. That's going to place any particular patient, it's going to locate them within one of these quadrants. And within the quadrant, they're going to have a kind of winding road journey. And as they move and as they feel more or less safe, they're going to move through these different levels of the quadrant and display different behaviors. Things like in the fight quadrant, narcissistic or highly defensive, aggressive behavior. Whereas in a fawning response, right, we might see more codependence, but over giving of themselves. You guys know a lot of this stuff already, but the point is that there are lots of different handles onto trauma, both reported and unreported. The thing to remember as we observe these and work with clients is that those observed behaviors are just the tip of an iceberg, right? Those are coping behaviors, but the trauma itself lies below the surface, which is why it's super important to take a root cause approach. And that is at the beating heart of what we do at Neurologics. It's why we choose to use a tool like EEG, is because it allows us to get at things that are unreported and things that lie at the root that people might not even be aware of. They couldn't report it even if they wanted to. Otherwise, all we're doing is symptom reduction and trying to manage the effects of the maladaptive root cause. Okay, so when we're working with patients who've experienced trauma, how does that influence what we do at Neurologics? It influences a number of things. First of all, as I've said before, we work best as part of a larger therapeutic team. So we immediately share trauma-related findings with our partners to inform the larger treatment plan. The scheduling for mapping and optimization and the environments in which those take place are completely customizable. We take them case by case. There are a lot of different kinds of environments and schedules that might need to be adjusted when you're working with someone who's experiencing trauma responses. The dials and settings that drive the optimization process are all adjusted based on what we find in the brain map, including those trauma signatures. The timing over the longer term of those adaptive cycles as we're building capacity and achieving neural homeostasis, that's all adjusted on a case-by-case basis based on how trauma is impacting that client. We continue to measure that homeostasis and we optimize until it's achieved. At the end of the day, basically, all this means that we're meeting those clients where they are and we're following them along the path that they need. Maybe most importantly, and this is the last thing that I think I'll say before I hand it over to Karen, is how does what we do at Neurologics help you as you work with your clients who've experienced trauma? I've already stressed that Neurologics brain maps can reveal unreported trauma, or, and this is maybe the case as often as not, it confirms trauma that you suspect, but that you'd like some additional corroboration for. Neurologics optimization is great at restoring dysregulated cognition, which is one of the main responses that's observable in trauma. And if you're doing any kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, it's super helpful if the cognition is in place. Otherwise, you're kind of working with a broken wing. So that's very helpful. We're very excited about this aspect. The cognitive regulation and the sort of secondary effect of improved emotional regulation that goes with improved cognitive regulation can be very helpful in the preparation phase of any of the growing collection of adaptive information processing therapies. So the well-known versions of this are EMDR or critical incident stress debriefing, right? There are a number of therapies that are all based on an adaptive information processing theory base. And there are different ways to essentially get the client to, in a safe environment, re-experience the trauma without being re-traumatized, such that they can begin to process it in an adaptive way. And a lot of times practitioners of these methods feel like they need to kind of go deep in order to avoid the re-traumatization. Because remember, avoiding re-traumatization is one of those 4 R's. Super important. You don't have to go as deep, and you don't have to be as worried about re-traumatization with a client that has undergone optimization, because they've achieved a kind of cognitive release through optimization that helps them avoid re-traumatization. And then we don't brain map just once at the beginning. We brain map every couple of months as a client progresses. And so that remapping can serve to document not only their progress with optimization at Neurologics, but it also is objective data that can document and validate progress that they're making in their larger therapeutic program. Because, right, the brain is the brain is the brain. The brain doesn't care whether it's improving because of Neurologics or any other kind of therapy, but we will see those improvements through a brain map. So at the end of the day, we at Neurologics complement you and you complement us so that together we can provide true trauma-informed care for your clients. I've talked a lot. So at this point, we've got some results that we can share of clients for whom trauma response was a definite issue, and we can sort of show you what's possible. Karen, would you like to take over at this point, or we can open it up for a question pause as well?
Why don't we pause for questions? I'm always up for people to ask questions as they have them. So if we've talked about anything that people have questions about so far, I just love to give people that opportunity.
I've exhausted everyone.
It's a lot. It's a lot to take in. So if there aren't immediate questions, then maybe we can go over some cases and some results. Our goal is to collaborate.
Okay, I do see one question. Yeah.
Oh, good.
So Julie asks, you mentioned weakening neurological synapses that need weakening. How do you do that? Great question. We take advantage of the brain's natural tendency to do that on its own. So you can think of this, if you're familiar with pruning in the normal course of neural development for children and adolescents, right? How that works is the brain goes through alternating phases of producing lots and lots of new neurons and making lots and lots of connections, and then pauses to let the person interact with their environment and sample out all the new possible connections. And then the ones that prove useful get strengthened simply through use, right? That's something that synapses do. The more you use them, the more they strengthen. And then the ones that prove less useful get used less. And then the brain, through its own programming, prunes those connections away, or in more moderate cases, simply weakens the synapses. Neurobiologically, that happens in 2 different ways: fast ways that have to do with ions and slow ways that have to do with gene expression. But the big picture is essentially in optimization, we expose them to different challenges and tasks. They get subtle rewards for adaptive responses, and they don't get rewarded for maladaptive responses. And then the brain naturally will strengthen the connections that proved useful, and it will weaken connections that weren't as useful. Good. All right. All right, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to advance to the next slide and hand it over to Karen.
So this is what our brain map report of findings looks like. It's designed for multidisciplinary team, meaning people learn differently. I'm one of those people. The information is conveyed in multiple different ways, but the simple sort of traffic light way that we look at this is red is bad, green is good, yellow is pause, and the fourth color, blue, is gifted. And so if you look at this kind of report quickly, you recognize that the baseline map, which is on the left for this young man, has a lot of red on the left-hand side. This is a child who was in foster care, who was adopted, and then in his first adoptive family home, he witnessed horrendous abuse prior to age 5. He then was adopted by a second family, wonderful family, and that family saw a lot of the symptoms when Peter did the slide of capital T trauma. He was assaultive, he was abusive, he was alternately shut down, shame-filled, and at times absolutely self-loathing. His first map is the one on the left. So you can see that everything's normed to 100, and his IQ baseline map started out at 102. One of the amazing things that Neurologics optimization provides is that after optimization, his current functional IQ is 122. So he moved 20 points. That is more than we promise. What we promise is that every client who has done optimization and completed optimization moves their functional IQ permanently for 15 points. What does that mean, you might ask? What does it mean to have 15 functional IQ points or more, in this case 20? It's the difference between, on the left, that is a trade school IQ. That is an IQ where certainly he could function unsupervised and could be a productive member of society, but he would certainly struggle in college. The functional IQ on the right-hand side, 122, he could do college now with ease. His stress default is still something we're working on. That has moved from 80 to 84, and his regulation ability moved 10 points from 72 to 84. So when we talk about regulation, those are all of the things Peter addressed previously in the slides, where the ability to not dissociate. This was also part of this young man's history. And I would certainly describe his trauma as capital T trauma versus small t trauma. Just the level and repetition and duration of his trauma was so substantial. He would be characterized by Bessel van der Kolk as capital T trauma, which for him was certainly felt in the body as well. And then if you look at his resilience and relapse index, he is not a child who's had access to substances yet. He's an adolescent, but certainly when he was at 74, one of the other coping strategies that, when I look through my adolescent therapist who specializes in substance use disorder lens, I would say that this is a child unoptimized who certainly may discover substances as an effort to self-soothe. And as you can see, that moved 10 points, an entire standard deviation as well. Being present index moved 12 points from 72 to 84. And his emotional recovery also moved to 84. So if you look on the left-hand side at the things that were red, those have all moved into the yellow. And we'd like for him to stay, this is a current client, we'd like for him to stay with one more cycle until those yellow bars move to green. You can see that the green moved to giftedness. And so the things on the left-hand side that like thinking ability moved from green, which green is good, to blue, which is gifted, and they all moved into that gifted category. Next slide, please.
Right. I'm working on it.
Okay.
Just have a lag.
Sure. While we're talking about that, you'll notice on the right-hand side, there are checkboxes. Those checkboxes, we have an algorithm in the software that when, as part of the brain mapping, when the results are processed, that there are symptomology that gets checked off on the right-hand side. And as you can see on the right-hand side, optimized, his checkboxes are blank. Whereas in the beginning, before he optimized, the checkboxes were checked off, and there were multiple issues with regulation ability, with amotivational concerns, specifically emotional concerns. And he was a kid who moved from thought to action so swiftly that when he was in residential treatment and I was called in, he had been discharged from five treatment centers across the country. So he had been discharged for his emotional volatility and reactivity, and also running from 5 different specific treatment centers by the time that we were called in, to map him in one of those treatment centers and to come up with a plan for what would happen and where could he be contained while we calmed down all of the things in his brain that were red, and got him to a place where he could access his high ability to learn and process information while slowing down his ability to emotionally react. So again, you can see on the left the movement that he made from, really, if you're looking at the color change, because I'm trying to be conscious of everyone's time, from red to yellow, from green to blue. What does that mean in terms of the way that he functions and behaves? What it means is that he's currently in environment of high structure, and he's learning the framework. When Peter talks about us being the concrete and building the house, that's exactly right. He now has a brain that is able to process the framework that is being offered at a highly structured treatment facility, so that he can avail himself of new tools and be able to use and utilize his new brain. Next slide, please.
Okay, this is DC.
Yep, this is a new case. This is an adult patient. I generally, in my clinical practice, don't see people over 30. This is an exceptional case that I was asked to take when this woman, who has access to a trust fund as long as she is sober, had lost 12 years of her life. Her family had spent millions of dollars and sent her to 3 different countries. She had gone to 12 different treatment centers for substance use disorder. And at the time that I was called in for assessment, she was homeless in a homeless shelter in San Diego. And having been discharged from multiple treatment centers for, again, symptoms of trauma, for lying, for deceptive behaviors, for she also had an inability to self-regulate, and she medicated with substances. In her case, it was profound that head trauma was determined to be part of her trauma as well. So her origin story began with, as a child, she was doing a cartwheel, and this was not reported until the brain map picked it up. So multiple times the family was asked, does she have a history of traumatic brain injury or head trauma? No, multiple times. She was also asked, do you have a history of trauma? And her answer was head trauma, and her answer was, I don't remember. And she also couldn't recall the trauma that she had experienced in South Africa, where she was kidnapped and held for ransom for a long period of time until her family paid it. During that time, she was brutally assaulted and abused, and her brain map certainly is reflective of someone with capital T trauma. So in this case, it was working with the complex family system to understand the origin. The beginning of her capital T trauma was that she was doing a cartwheel in the family's living room. She hit a marble coffee table with her head, lost consciousness, bled from the nose and ears. And the family didn't recall this, and neither did the client. And so when the signature presented itself for traumatic brain injury, then there was a much more in-depth discussion of where did the head trauma occur? How could it have occurred? There was a discussion with multiple extended family members. And at that time, the origin was not just one, but 2 pieces. There was the first trip to the emergency room relative to the coffee table. And then later, when the family moved house, she had a large 4-poster bed that when she was playing hide and go seek behind the headboard on moving day, the marble headboard fell and trapped her underneath the headboard. You can see her movement moved from at the baseline to optimization. She moved from functional IQ of in the red to to a functional IQ of 101. Also, her stress default moved 5 points. And this is not her final brain map. This was her first brain map from baseline to follow-on brain map. She moved sequentially. And ultimately, this is a client who has now been able to achieve long-term meaningful sobriety. She's married. She volunteers in the community. So sort of one of the things I'm asked repeatedly is what happens when the numeric moves? How does the client able to access and learn new skills? She went to residential treatment for 90 days. She then was in structured sober living for 12 months. And since that time has been sober for, multiple years, and she's married and a productive member of society. I want to be conscious of the time and say, thank you so very much. I'm happy to stay, as is Peter, to talk through any questions that you might have. We're also happy to, if you would like to speak to Peter or Dr. Hack about, specific clinical cases, we're happy to arrange private clinical consultation by Zoom. And we also have monthly coffee chats where you can bring cases and talk about how Neurologics could be integrated into the treatment that you're already providing. Thanks so much for your time, and thank you, Peter, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, and thanks everyone.